The way Thomas More said his name now made Mark Roberts feel like he was drowning in honey. It started 3 weeks ago, this shift in pronunciation that turned his ordinary name into something sacred, something whispered like a prayer. Mark had noticed it immediately because he had been cataloging every change in Thomas for months now, every subtle shift in the way his best friend looked at him, spoke to him, existed in his presence. Thomas had always been confident, the kind of person who filled rooms with his laughter and drew people into his orbit without effort. But lately there was something different, something softer. When he said Mark's name now, it came out like silk, like he was tasting each letter before letting it go. Mark, not the sharp, casual Mark of their college years or the playful Mark of their weekend adventures. This was something else entirely. Mark pressed his back against the kitchen counter, watching Thomas pace across the living room of their shared apartment. Thomas was talking about his girlfriend again, Michelle Green, and how things weren't working out the way he had hoped. But Mark wasn't really listening to the words anymore. He was listening to the spaces between them, the way Thomas's voice caught when he turned to look at him, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long. "I've been in love with you for 2 years and 7 months, Mark thought, gripping his coffee mug tighter. The ceramic was warm against his palms, grounding him in the moment while his heart performed its familiar acrobatics. 2 years and 7 months of being the best friend, the confidant, the one Thomas came to when his relationships fell apart. 2 years and 7 months of pretending that each story about Michelle, or the girl before her, or the one before that, didn't feel like a knife turning in his chest. Thomas stopped pacing and looked directly at him. "Mark," he said, and there it was again, that new way of saying his name that made his knees weak. "What do you think I should do?" Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments, because what happens next will change everything between these two best friends forever. Mark set his coffee down carefully, buying himself a moment to breathe. The morning light streaming through their apartment windows caught the gold flecks in Thomas's brown eyes, and Mark had to look away before he said something he couldn't take back. "You know what I think," he said quietly. "I think you deserve someone who makes you feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when Mark looked up, he found Thomas studying his face with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm looking for the wrong things," Thomas said softly. "Mark," his name again, spoken like a secret. "Do you ever feel like you're playing a role that doesn't quite fit?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Mark felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "Every day," he wanted to say. "Every single day since I realized I was in love with my straight best friend." Instead, he nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he managed. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, with Thomas questioning everything he thought he knew about himself, and Mark teetering on the edge of a confession that could destroy their friendship, we need to go back 3 months earlier, to the night when everything began to shift. It had been a Tuesday in September when Thomas first knocked on Mark's bedroom door at 2 in the morning. Mark had been lying awake anyway, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about the way Thomas had laughed at dinner, head thrown back, completely unself-conscious and beautiful. The knock was soft, hesitant. "Mark," Thomas had called through the door, his voice muffled and strange. "Are you awake?" Mark had opened the door to find Thomas standing in the hallway in his pajamas, hair messed from sleep, looking younger and more vulnerable than Mark had seen him in years. "Michelle and I had another fight," Thomas said without preamble. "Can I sleep in your bed tonight? I just don't want to be alone." The request had surprised Mark. They had been best friends since their sophomore year of college, roommates for the past 18 months. But Thomas had never asked for this kind of comfort before. He dealt with relationship problems by going for long runs, or calling his sister, or throwing himself into work. He didn't seek out physical closeness, especially not with Mark. "Of course," Mark had said, stepping aside to let Thomas in. They had arranged themselves carefully on opposite sides of Mark's queen bed, a careful distance between them that felt both natural and charged with electricity. Thomas had fallen asleep quickly, but Mark had lain awake for hours, hyper-aware of every sound Thomas made, every shift in the mattress. When Mark woke up the next morning, Thomas was gone, but there was a cup of coffee waiting for him in the kitchen and a note that said simply, "Thanks, Mark. You're the best friend a guy could ask for. That should have been in our end of it. A one-time thing, a moment of vulnerability that they would politely ignore going forward. But it wasn't. 2 weeks later, Thomas was back at his door, this time after a particularly brutal day at work. 3 days after that, it was because he couldn't sleep, then because he had a headache, then because Michelle was out of town and the apartment felt too quiet. Each time, Thomas said Mark's name a little differently, less casual, more careful, like he was learning a new language, and Mark's name was the first word he wanted to master. Mark told himself he was imagining it. Thomas was straight, had been in a relationship with Michelle for 8 months, talked about her constantly even when he was complaining about their problems. The way he said Mark's name was probably just Thomas being Thomas, warm and affectionate like he was with everyone he cared about. But then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday in October, and Thomas had shown up at Mark's door without explanation, looking exhausted and defeated. He had crawled into bed beside Mark without asking, and for the first time, he hadn't stayed on his side of the mattress. Instead, he had curled up close enough that Mark could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell his shampoo and the faint scent of his cologne. "Mark," Thomas had whispered into the darkness, "do you think there's something wrong with me?" The question had caught Mark off guard. "What do you mean?" he had whispered back. "I don't know," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "I love Michelle. Why, I do. She's beautiful and smart and funny and everything I should want. But when I'm with her, I feel like I'm acting, like I'm playing the part of someone who's supposed to be happy but isn't quite managing it." Mark's heart had started beating so hard he was sure Thomas could hear it. "There's nothing wrong with you," he said carefully. "Sometimes relationships just don't work out, even when they look perfect on paper." "But that's just it," Thomas said, turning onto his side to face Mark in the darkness. "It's not just Michelle. It's every relationship I've ever had. I go through all the motions, I say all the right things, but there's always something missing. Like I'm waiting for something that never comes." They had lain there in the dark, so close that Mark could feel Thomas's breath on his face, and Mark had wanted desperately to close the distance between them, to show Thomas exactly what he had been missing. Instead, he had whispered, "Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet." Thomas had been quiet for so long that Mark thought he had fallen asleep. Then, so softly that Mark almost missed it, Thomas said, "Mark, what if the right person has been right here all along and I've been too blind to see it?" Mark's world had tilted on its axis in that moment. He had lain perfectly still, afraid to breathe, afraid to move, afraid to hope. Thomas's words hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, full of possibility and terror in equal measure. "What are you saying?" Mark had whispered, his voice barely audible in the darkness. But Thomas had already turned away, curling in on himself. "I don't know," he said, and his voice was thick with confusion and something that might have been fear. "I don't know what I'm saying. Forget I said anything." Mark had wanted to reach out, to turn Thomas back toward him, to demand answers to the questions that were suddenly burning through his chest like wildfire. Instead, he had lain awake until dawn, listening to Thomas's breathing even out into sleep, replaying those words over and over until they were burned into his memory. The next morning, Thomas had acted like nothing had happened. He made coffee and toast, chatted about his plans for the weekend, mentioned that Michelle was coming over for dinner. But Mark caught him staring sometimes, his gaze lingering on Mark's face with an intensity that made Mark's pulse quicken. And Thomas started saying his name differently, softer, like it meant something sacred. The weeks that followed were a special kind of torture for Mark. Thomas continued to seek out his company, continued to show up at his bedroom door on nights when sleep eluded him, continued to curl up close enough that Mark could count his heartbeats. But he also continued to date Michelle, continued to go through the motions of their relationship even as he complained more and more frequently about feeling disconnected, feeling like he was living someone else's life. Mark found himself walking a tightrope between hope and despair. Every soft pronunciation of his name felt like a promise. Every mention of Michelle felt like a door slamming shut. He started avoiding Thomas when he could, making excuses to be out of the apartment, throwing himself into work and social obligations that kept him busy and distracted. But Thomas noticed. Of course he noticed. Mark, Thomas said one evening in November, cornering him in the kitchen as Mark tried to escape to his room with a hastily assembled dinner. You've been avoiding me. Mark's hands tightened around his plate. I haven't been avoiding you, he said, not meeting Thomas's eyes. I've just been busy. Busy, Thomas repeated, and there was something sharp in his voice that Mark had never heard before. Too busy for your best friend. Too busy to talk to me when I'm trying to figure out why my life feels like it's falling apart. The accusation hit Mark like a physical blow. He set his plate down on the counter and finally looked at Thomas, really looked at him. Thomas's eyes were bright with frustration and something that looked like hurt, and Mark felt his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. I'm sorry, Mark said quietly. I didn't realize you needed to talk. I always need to talk to you, Thomas said, and his voice broke slightly on the words. You're the only person who makes sense to me anymore, Mark. The only person who feels real. The admission hung between them, raw and honest and dangerous. Mark felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt the familiar ache of wanting something he couldn't have, spreading through his chest like a wildfire. Thomas? He started, but Thomas cut him off. Michelle and I broke up, Thomas said abruptly. 3 days ago. I should have told you, but I didn't know how to explain why I wasn't upset about it. Why I felt relieved instead of heartbroken. Mark stared at him, trying to process this information. You broke up, he repeated stupidly. She said I wasn't present, Thomas continued, running a hand through his hair in the gesture Mark knew meant he was nervous. She said it felt like I was always thinking about someone else, always somewhere else in my head. And the thing is, Mark, she was right. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Mark gripped the edge of the counter behind him, needing something solid to anchor him as the ground shifted beneath his feet. Where were you? He asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Thomas took a step closer, close enough that Mark could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, could smell his cologne and the faint scent of his shampoo. I was thinking about you, Thomas said simply. I'm always thinking about you. The confession hit Mark like lightning, illuminating everything and leaving him stunned in its wake. He stared at Thomas, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But Thomas's expression was deadly serious, vulnerable in a way Mark had never seen before. Thomas, Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. What are you saying? I'm saying that I think I've been lying to myself for a long time, Thomas said, taking another step closer. I'm saying that maybe I've been looking for something in all the wrong places when it's been right here all along. I'm saying that when I close my eyes at night, it's your face I see. When I wake up in the morning, it's your voice I want to hear. When I imagine my future, you're in every single version of it. Mark felt like he was drowning, like the air had been sucked out of the room and replaced with something thick and electric. This couldn't be happening. Thomas was straight, had always been straight, had dated women exclusively for as long as Mark had known him. This had to be some kind of mistake, some kind of confusion brought on by the breakup and their recent closeness. But the way Thomas was looking at him, the way his name sounded when Thomas said it, the way Thomas's hands were shaking slightly at his sides, all of it felt devastatingly real. I don't understand, Mark said, his voice cracking. You're straight. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. Am I? He asked. Because I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and I'm not so sure anymore. I've been thinking about how I've never felt with any woman the way I feel when I'm with you. I've been thinking about how I measure every relationship against what we have, and they all come up short. I've been thinking about how the only time I feel like myself is when I'm here, with you. Mark's heart was beating so hard he was sure Thomas could hear it. This was everything he had dreamed of and everything he had feared, wrapped up in a moment that felt too fragile to be real. You don't know what you're saying, he whispered. You're confused. You just got out of a relationship. You're not thinking clearly. Thomas stepped closer again, close enough now that Mark could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Mark, he said, and there it was again, that soft, sacred pronunciation that made Mark's knees weak. I've never been more clear about anything in my life. I know this is scary. I know this changes everything, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep acting like what I feel for you is just friendship when it's so much more than that. Mark pressed himself back against the counter, feeling trapped between Thomas's confession and his own desperate need to protect himself from the possibility of heartbreak. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How long have you felt this way?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching Mark's face. "Honestly," he said finally, "I think I've been in love with you since the day we met. I just didn't have the words for it. I didn't understand what it meant to want someone the way I want you. I kept thinking that what I felt for you was just really intense friendship, that the reason I couldn't connect with anyone else was because I had such a strong platonic bond with you. But it's not platonic, Mark. It never was." The words hit Mark like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He stared at Thomas, seeing him clearly for the first time, seeing the love and fear and desperate hope written across his features. This beautiful, wonderful man who had been his best friend for years, who had unknowingly held Mark's heart in his hands all this time, was standing in their kitchen, confessing his love. "Thomas," Mark breathed, and he saw Thomas flinch slightly at the way his name sounded, broken and overwhelmed. "I know this is a lot," Thomas said quickly, misreading Mark's reaction. "I know I'm probably ruining everything by telling you this, but I couldn't keep it inside anymore. If you don't feel the same way, if this makes you uncomfortable, we can pretend this conversation never happened. We can go back to being just friends, I promise." Mark felt something inside him break open at Thomas's words, at the fear and vulnerability in his voice. This man who had always been so confident, so sure of himself, was standing here offering to pretend away his feelings just to preserve their friendship. The generosity of it, the selflessness, made Mark's chest ache with love so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. "You think I don't feel the same way," Mark said, his voice stronger now, steadier. "You think this is one-sided." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "Isn't it?" he asked, hope and terror warring in his expression. Mark pushed himself away from the counter, closing the distance between them until they were standing close enough to touch. "Thomas," he said, reaching up to cup Thomas's face in his hands, feeling the slight roughness of stubble against his palms. "I have been in love with you for 2 years and 7 months. I have spent every day since I realized it trying to be the friend you needed while dying a little bit inside every time you talked about Michelle or any of the others. I have memorized the way you laugh, the way you look when you're thinking, the way you say my name when you're happy or sad or confused. I have built my entire world around loving you from a distance because I thought it was the only way I could have you in my life." Thomas's eyes fluttered closed, and Mark felt him lean into the touch, felt the slight tremor that ran through him. 2 years and 7 months, Thomas whispered. "God, Mark, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I put you through that. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure this out." "Don't apologize," Mark said, his thumbs brushing across Thomas's cheekbones. "Don't apologize for taking the time you needed to understand yourself. I would have waited forever if that's what it took." Thomas opened his eyes, and Mark saw tears gathering there, saw love and relief and something that looked like wonder. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "Now," Mark said, leaning closer until their foreheads touched, until he could feel Thomas's breath on his lips. "We figure it out together. We take it one day at a time. We learn how to be this instead of what we were before." "I'm scared," Thomas admitted, his hands coming up to cover Mark's where they rested against his face. "I'm terrified that I'll mess this up, that I won't know how to love you the way you deserve to be loved." "You already love me the way I deserve to be loved," Mark said softly. "You've been doing it for years without even knowing it. The way you take care of me when I'm sick, the way you listen when I need to talk, the way you make me feel like I matter, like I'm important. That's love, Thomas. You already know how to do this." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching Mark's face. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been thinking about kissing you for weeks, and I need to know what it feels like." Mark's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. "Yes," he breathed, and then Thomas's lips were on his, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as Mark kissed him back. The kiss was everything Mark had imagined and nothing like he had expected. It was gentle and desperate at the same time, full of years of unspoken longing and the overwhelming relief of finally finally being able to touch the person he loved most in the world. Thomas tasted like coffee and possibility, like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against Mark's and smiled. The first real smile Mark had seen from him in months. "Wow," Thomas whispered. "That felt." "Right," Mark finished, and Thomas nodded. "So right," Thomas agreed, like everything finally makes sense. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the warm light of their kitchen, both of them trying to adjust to this new reality where they were allowed to touch, allowed to love each other openly. Mark felt like he was dreaming, like he might wake up at any moment to find himself alone in his bed, Thomas sleeping soundly in the next room. This conversation nothing more than wishful thinking, but Thomas's hands were real and warm where they rested on Mark's waist. His eyes were real and bright with love when he looked at Mark, and the way he said Mark's name now, soft and sacred and full of promise, was the most real thing Mark had ever heard. "What happens now?" Mark asked, echoing Thomas's earlier question. "Do we tell people? Do we figure out what this means for us? For our living situation? For everything?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing absent patterns on Mark's hip where his hands had settled. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've never done this before. Never been with a man, never had to navigate coming out or changing the fundamental nature of the most important relationship in my life. But I know I want to figure it out with you. I know I don't want to go back to pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than love." Mark nodded, understanding the fear and uncertainty in Thomas's voice, because he felt it too. This was uncharted territory for both of them, a complete upheaval of everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. But underneath the fear was a steady current of rightness, a sense that this was always where they were meant to end up. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," Mark said. "We can take this slow, figure things out as we go. The only thing that matters is that we're honest with each other and with ourselves about what we want." "What I want," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength and certainty, "is you. I want to wake up next to you and not have to pretend it's just because I couldn't sleep. I want to hold your hand when we're watching movies. I want to kiss you goodnight and good morning. And just because I feel like it, I want to build a life with you that feels real and honest and ours." The words sent warmth spreading through Mark's chest, a feeling of completion he had never experienced before. "That's what I want too," he said. "All of it." Thomas smiled, that bright, genuine smile that had been missing for so long. "Then we're on the same page," he said. "We're both terrified and both sure that this is right. Both completely in love," Mark added, and Thomas's smile grew even brighter. "Both completely in love," Thomas agreed. They kissed again, longer this time, with less desperation and more exploration. Mark marveled at the way Thomas's lips felt against his, at the way Thomas's hands tangled in his hair, at the soft sounds Thomas made when Mark deepened the kiss. This was Thomas, his Thomas, finally his in the way he had dreamed of for so long. When they broke apart this time, Thomas rested his head on Mark's shoulder, and Mark wrapped his arms around him, holding him close. "I can't believe this is real," Thomas murmured against Mark's neck. "I can't believe I almost let fear keep me from telling you how I felt." "I'm glad you found the courage," Mark said, pressing a kiss to the top of Thomas's head. "I'm glad we both did." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in their kitchen as the sun set outside their windows, both of them trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just changed between them. Mark felt like he was floating, like his feet might not be touching the ground anymore. After 2 years and 7 months of loving Thomas from a distance, he was finally allowed to love him openly, completely, without reservation. "I should probably call my sister," Thomas said eventually, his voice muffled against Mark's shoulder. "She's been telling me for months that I was in love with you, and I kept insisting she was crazy." "Your sister knew?" Mark asked, surprised. Thomas lifted his head to look at him, his eyes bright with amusement. "Apparently it was obvious to everyone except me. She said the way I talked about you, the way my whole face changed when I mentioned your name, made it pretty clear that my feelings weren't exactly platonic. I just wasn't ready to hear it." Mark laughed, shaking his head. "All this time I thought I was being so careful to hide how I felt, and apparently everyone could see it." "Not everyone," Thomas said softly. "I couldn't see it. Or maybe I could, but I was too scared to acknowledge what it meant. I'm sorry it took me so long to catch up. You're here now, Mark said, cupping Thomas's face again. Still amazed that he was allowed to touch him like this. That's what matters. Thomas leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed. I love the way you say my name, he said quietly. I love the way you've always said my name, but now I can tell you that I love it. Mark's heart did something complicated in his chest. I love the way you say mine too, he admitted, especially lately. You started saying it differently a few weeks ago, softer, and it drove me crazy because I couldn't figure out what it meant. It meant I was falling in love with you, Thomas said, opening his eyes to meet Mark's gaze. It meant I was starting to understand what you meant to me, even if I wasn't ready to put words to it yet. They were interrupted by the sound of Mark's phone buzzing on the counter. Mark glanced at it, then at Thomas. It can wait, he said, but Thomas shook his head. Answer it, Thomas said. We have all the time in the world now. Mark picked up the phone, glancing at the screen. It was his friend, Nicholas Morris, probably calling to make plans for the weekend. Hey, Nick, Mark answered, and Thomas grinned at the way Mark's voice sounded, happy and relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months. Mark, Nicholas said, and Mark could hear the smile in his voice. You sound different, good different. What's going on? Mark looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. A lot, Mark said. Actually, can I call you back? I have some news to share, but I want to give it the attention it deserves. Good news, Nicholas asked. The best news, Mark confirmed, and Thomas's smile grew even brighter. After Mark hung up, Thomas pulled him close again. I like this, he said. I like being your good news instead of your secret heartbreak. You were never just heartbreak, Mark said. You were always the best part of my day, even when it hurt to love you. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his expression growing serious. I hate that I hurt you, he said. I hate that my confusion caused you pain. It wasn't your fault, Mark said firmly. You can't help how long it takes to understand yourself. And honestly, Thomas, even if you had never figured this out, even if we had stayed just friends forever, loving you still would have been worth it. You're worth it. Thomas's eyes filled with tears again, and he pulled Mark into another kiss, this one desperate and grateful and full of promises. When they broke apart, Thomas rested his forehead against Mark's and whispered, I love you. I'm in love with you. I want to say it a million times to make up for all the times I should have said it before. I love you too, Mark whispered back. I'm so in love with you it sometimes feels like I can't breathe. But now you can breathe, Thomas said. Now we both can. Mark nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. For the first time in 2 years and 7 months, he could breathe freely, love openly, hope without reservation. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but bright with possibility. They spent the rest of the evening on their couch, talking about everything and nothing, relearning how to be with each other now that the truth was finally out in the open. Thomas curled up against Mark's side like he had so many times before, but now Mark was allowed to run his fingers through Thomas's hair, was allowed to press kisses to the top of his head, was allowed to hold him like he was precious and beloved, instead of just a friend seeking comfort. When they finally went to bed, it was together, in Mark's room with no pretense about nightmares or insomnia. They lay facing each other in the darkness, hands intertwined between them, both of them too wired with happiness and relief to sleep right away. This feels like a dream, Thomas whispered in the darkness. A really good dream that I don't want to wake up from. It's not a dream, Mark whispered back, squeezing Thomas's hand. This is real. We're real. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, Mark, there it was again, that soft, sacred pronunciation that made Mark's heart skip. What if I'm not good at this? What if I don't know how to be what you need? You already are what I need, Mark said. You have been for years. The only thing that's changed is that now I get to tell you that I love you. Now I get to kiss you. Now I get to hold you without pretending it doesn't mean everything to me. Thomas shifted closer until they were sharing the same breath. I want to be good at loving you, he said. I want to learn everything about what makes you happy, what makes you feel cherished, what makes you feel like you're exactly where you belong. You already make me feel like that, Mark said. Just by being here, by choosing this, by choosing me. Thomas kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, he whispered, "I choose you, Mark. Today and tomorrow and every day after that. I choose us." Mark felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple certainty in Thomas's voice. "I choose us too," he whispered back. They fell asleep like that, hands intertwined, hearts finally at peace, the space between them charged with love and possibility, and the quiet joy of finally being exactly where they belonged. Mark woke up the next morning to the feeling of lips pressed against his forehead and the soft murmur of his name. Thomas was already awake, propped up on one elbow, looking down at him with an expression of such tender affection that Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Good morning," Thomas said softly, and Mark could hear the smile in his voice. "Good morning," Mark replied, reaching up to touch Thomas's face, still amazed that he was allowed to do this now. "How long have you been awake?" "Not long," Thomas said. "I was just watching you sleep and thinking about how different everything feels now." "Better." "Right," Mark smiled, pulling Thomas down for a kiss. "It does feel right," he agreed. "It feels like this is how it was always supposed to be." Thomas settled back down beside him, curving his body around Mark's in a way that felt natural and perfect. "I called Michelle last night," he said quietly, "after you fell asleep. I wanted to apologize for not being present in our relationship, for not being honest about why I was so distracted." "How did she take it?" Mark asked. "Better than I expected," Thomas said. "She said she had suspected for a while that my heart was somewhere else, and she was glad I finally figured out where. She said she could see how happy you made me, even when I was too confused to understand what that meant." Mark felt a rush of gratitude toward Michelle, this woman he had never met but who had been gracious enough to let Thomas go without bitterness. "That was generous of her," he said. "She's a good person," Thomas agreed. "She deserves someone who can love her the way she deserves to be loved, the way I love you." The simple statement sent warmth flooding through Mark's chest. He turned in Thomas's arms so they were facing each other again, so he could see the love and certainty in Thomas's eyes. "I still can't quite believe this is real," he admitted. "I'm afraid I'm going to wake up and find out I dreamed the whole thing." Thomas smiled, leaning forward to press a soft kiss to Mark's lips. "It's real," he said. "I'm real, you're real, this is real, and I'm not going anywhere." They spent the morning in bed, talking and kissing, and learning the new rhythm of being together like this. Thomas was gentle and curious, asking questions about what Mark liked, what felt good, what he had imagined during all those months of secret longing. Mark found himself more open than he had ever been with anyone, sharing fantasies and fears with equal honesty. When they finally got up, Thomas insisted on making breakfast, claiming he wanted to cook for Mark as his boyfriend for the first time. The word boyfriend felt strange and wonderful on both their tongues, a new vocabulary for a relationship that had always been extraordinary, but was now finally free to be everything it was meant to be. They were sitting at their kitchen table, sharing scrambled eggs and toast, when Thomas's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and grinned. "It's my sister," he said. "I texted her last night to tell her she was right about everything." "Answer it," Mark said, curious to hear Victoria Thompson's reaction to the news. Thomas put the phone on speaker and answered with a cheerful, "Good morning, Victoria." "Thomas Moore," Victoria's voice came through clearly, warm with affection and amusement. "I got your text. I have to say, I'm proud of you for finally pulling your head out of your ass." Thomas laughed, his cheeks flushing slightly. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," he said. "Mark's here too, by the way." "You're on speaker." "Mark," Victoria said, and Mark could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm so happy for you both. I've been watching my brother be an idiot about his feelings for you for months, and I was starting to wonder if I was going to have to stage an intervention." "An intervention?" Thomas asked, raising an eyebrow. "I had a whole plan," Victoria said. "I was going to invite you both to dinner and then conveniently disappear, leaving you alone with a bottle of wine and a playlist of romantic songs until one of you finally made a move." Mark laughed, imagining the scenario. "That might actually have worked," he said. "I'm glad it didn't come to that," Thomas said, reaching across the table to take Mark's hand. "I'm glad I found the courage to tell him how I felt without needing my sister's interference." "About time," Victoria said. "I love you both, and I'm so happy you finally figured this out. When do I get to see you two as an official couple?" "Soon," Thomas promised. "We're still figuring things out, but soon." After they hung up, Thomas squeezed Mark's hand. "My whole family is going to love you," he said. "I mean, they already love you as my best friend, but now they get to love you as the person who makes me happy. Your family already loves me, Mark asked, surprised. Thomas nodded. My parents ask about you every time we talk. Victoria has been trying to set you up with her friends for years because she thinks you're amazing. They all consider you part of the family already. The revelation filled Mark with warmth. He had always felt welcomed by Thomas's family during the few times they had met, but he had assumed it was just politeness, the courtesy extended to any close friend. To know that they genuinely cared about him, that they saw him as part of their family, felt like another gift in a day already full of them. What about your family? Thomas asked. How do you think they'll react? Mark considered the question. His parents had always been supportive and open-minded, and his younger brother had come out as bisexual 2 years earlier to nothing but love and acceptance. I think they'll be happy, he said. They've always liked you, and they want me to be happy. When they see how happy you make me, that's all they'll care about. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of happiness and adjustment. They called their closest friends to share the news, each conversation bringing laughter and congratulations and expressions of how obvious their feelings had been to everyone except themselves. They went for long walks, holding hands in public for the first time, marveling at how natural it felt. They cooked dinner together, watched movies curled up on their couch, fell asleep in each other's arms. By Sunday evening, the initial euphoria had settled into something deeper and more sustainable, a quiet contentment that felt like coming home. They were sitting on their balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Thomas's head resting on Mark's shoulder. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Thomas said quietly, for this to stop feeling so right, or for some obstacle to appear that we can't overcome. It feels too good to be true. Mark pressed a kiss to the top of Thomas's head. I know what you mean, he said, but maybe sometimes the good things really are just good. Maybe sometimes you get exactly what you have been hoping for without having to fight for it or sacrifice something else. Maybe, Thomas agreed, but Mark could hear the lingering uncertainty in his voice. What are you really worried about? Mark asked gently. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then said, I'm worried that I won't be enough. I've never been with a man before, never navigated a relationship like this. What if I disappoint you? What if the reality of being with me doesn't live up to what you imagined during all those months of wanting me? Mark turned slightly so he could see Thomas's face. Thomas, he said, waiting until Thomas met his eyes, you could never disappoint me. The reality of being with you is already better than anything I imagined, and we've only been together for 3 days. You're kind and thoughtful and generous, and you make me laugh, and you hold me like I'm precious to you. That's all I've ever wanted. But what if I'm not good at the physical stuff? Thomas said, his cheeks flushing. What if I don't know how to touch you the way you want to be touched? Or what if it's awkward because I'm still figuring out what I like? Mark cupped Thomas's face in his hands, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones. We'll figure it out together, he said. There's no pressure, no timeline, no expectations except that we're honest with each other about what we want and what feels good. I've waited 2 years and 7 months to be with you, Thomas. I'm not in any hurry now that I have you. Thomas leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed. I love you, he said, the words coming out like a prayer. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I love you too, Mark said. And I'm not going anywhere. We have all the time in the world to figure this out. They kissed as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, soft and slow and full of promise. When they broke apart, Thomas smiled, the worry lines around his eyes finally smoothing out. Okay, he said. I trust you. I trust us. Good, Mark said, pulling Thomas closer. Because this is just the beginning. 3 months later, Mark woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Thomas humming in the kitchen. He lay in their bed for a moment, still sometimes amazed by the casual use of that word, their bed, before getting up to join the man he loved. He found Thomas standing at the stove, making pancakes and swaying slightly to the music only he could hear. Thomas turned when he heard Mark's footsteps, his face lighting up with the bright smile that still made Mark's heart skip beats. Good morning, beautiful, Thomas said, crossing the kitchen to pull Mark into his arms and kiss him thoroughly. Good morning, Mark replied when they broke apart, marveling as he did every morning at how natural this had become, how perfectly they fit together. The transition from best friends to lovers had been smoother than either of them had expected. There had been awkward moments, certainly, times when they had to navigate the difference between the casual intimacy of friendship and the deeper intimacy of romance. There had been conversations about boundaries and expectations, about coming out to extended family and colleagues, about what their future might look like. But through it all, the foundation of their friendship had remained solid, providing a base of trust and understanding that made every other aspect of their relationship feel secure. They knew each other's quirks and habits, knew how to comfort each other during difficult times, knew how to make each other laugh when the world felt too heavy. The physical aspect of their relationship had developed gradually, with patience and communication and a lot of laughter. Thomas had been nervous at first, uncertain about his own desires and inexperienced with loving a man. But Mark's gentle guidance and unconditional acceptance had helped him relax into exploring this new part of himself. Their first time making love had been tender and sweet and slightly clumsy, full of whispered reassurances and soft laughter, and the overwhelming joy of finally being able to express their love physically. Thomas had cried afterward, overwhelmed by the intensity of emotion and the feeling of finally being completely himself with another person. Now, 3 months later, they moved around each other in their shared space with the easy grace of a couple who had learned each other's rhythms. Thomas knew that Mark liked his coffee strong and his eggs over easy. Mark knew that Thomas needed at least 20 minutes to fully wake up in the morning and that he did his best thinking while cooking. They had developed their own traditions and inside jokes, their own ways of showing love and affection. Thomas still said Mark's name in that soft, sacred way that made Mark's heart flutter. But now it was accompanied by casual touches and easy affection that spoke of security and belonging. Their friends and family had adjusted to the change with varying degrees of surprise and acceptance. But the overwhelming response had been happiness for their obvious joy in each other. Victoria had claimed credit for their relationship, insisting that her months of dropping hints had finally paid off. Mark's parents had welcomed Thomas into the family officially, treating him like the son-in-law they had always hoped for. The only real challenge had been Thomas's process of coming out, which had required patience and support as he navigated his own evolving understanding of his sexuality. There had been moments of doubt and confusion, times when Thomas worried that his attraction to Mark was somehow an anomaly rather than a genuine part of who he was. But those moments had become fewer and farther between as Thomas grew more comfortable with himself and his identity. He had started reading about sexuality and identity, talking to other people who had discovered their queerness later in life, attending support groups for people navigating similar journeys. Mark had been his constant support through it all, never pushing, but always available to listen, to reassure, to love him exactly as he was in each moment of his journey. The depth of Mark's patience and understanding had only deepened Thomas's love for him, had made him more certain with each passing day that Mark was his person, his home, his future. Now, as they sat at their kitchen table sharing breakfast and making plans for the day, Mark marveled at how natural it all felt. This was the life he had dreamed of during those long months of secret longing, but the reality was even better than his imagination had been able to conjure. "I have a meeting with a client this afternoon," Thomas said, reaching across the table to steal a bite of Mark's pancakes. "But I should be home by 6. Want to try that new restaurant we've been talking about?" "Sounds perfect," Mark said, catching Thomas's hand and pressing a kiss to his palm. I love you too," Thomas replied, and Mark felt the familiar flutter of happiness at hearing those words, at being able to say them freely, at having this beautiful, complicated, wonderful man choose him every single day. As Thomas got ready for work, humming that same tuneless melody he had been humming all morning, Mark reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had taken courage from both of them. Thomas's courage to question everything he thought he knew about himself, and Mark's courage to be vulnerable enough to accept love when it was finally offered. But they had made it through the uncertainty and confusion to arrive at this place of peace and joy and mutual belonging. They had learned that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, that grew from friendship into something deeper and more precious than either person had imagined possible. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for work and looking handsome and confident and completely at ease with himself. "Ready to face the world," he said with a grin. Ready to face anything, Mark agreed, standing to kiss Thomas goodbye. As Thomas headed out the door, he called back, "Mark." The way he said it still made Mark's heart skip, still carried that soft, sacred quality that had first made Mark hope that maybe, just maybe, his feelings weren't as unrequited as he had believed. "I love the way you say my name," Mark called after him. Thomas paused in the doorway, turning back with that bright Utsmere smile that had captured Mark's heart years ago and continued to make him fall in love all over again every single day. "I love everything about you," Thomas said simply. "See you tonight." After Thomas left, Mark stood in their kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of their shared life, and felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. He thought about that night 3 months ago when Thomas had finally found the courage to speak his truth, when they had finally stopped pretending that what they felt for each other was anything less than love. The journey hadn't always been easy, but it had been worth every moment of uncertainty and fear and to arrive at this place of complete honesty and mutual devotion. They had learned that love didn't always announce itself with fanfare and drama. Sometimes it whispered itself into existence through the soft pronunciation of a name, through the gradual recognition that the person you needed most in the world had been right beside you all along. Mark smiled, already looking forward to Thomas coming home that evening, to the continuation of this beautiful life they were building together one day at a time. Sometimes the most sacred things were also the simplest, he realized. Sometimes love was just two people choosing each other, again and again, with voices soft enough to make even ordinary names sound like prayers.